Welcome, AMK. Welcome to Nexus. And how are you doing this fine morning for me and evening on your end?
I'm doing good, thanks. How about you?
I'm good. Still waking up. I usually have red eyes in the winter when I wake up. It's I don't know what that's all about. But yeah, I guess it's a curse of being in Switzerland and the cold weather and the dry weather and whatnot. So yeah, yeah, welcome on the podcast for the first time. Um, it's the Nexus. I like this word, which is why I call it that. And let me tell you a little bit about myself. And then what I plan to do is I want to do a little first personal session, since it's our first time talking. I want to ask you a little bit about yourself and how you came into this whole, um, well, let me just adjust the webcam here. That's probably a bit better. How you came to be a mapper and interested in the whole, geopolitics and particularly Ukraine situation, as well as some personal, favorites of yours. And in particular, I wanted to ask you since, um, well, let me start with our common point of contact, which is Cut Off Calibrated. I had him on the podcast about probably close to a year back, between half a year and a year. And then I saw you on his podcast, and I was interested. In the meantime, I had a lot of personal changes and a big, kind of a rough patch, but now I'm back. And so, yeah, here we go. So I'm Mark. I'm in Switzerland, and I'm a physicist. And I can tell you something more about myself a bit later if you're interested. Let's just hop in and, well, get to know each other. As far as I heard on Scott's podcast on Calibrated, your name is Alloy, right?
Yes, Arlo.
Alloy. Wow. Pleased to meet you, Alloy. So tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you came to be interested in the whole mapping and geopolitics aspect?
Well, for mapping, I've kind of always been interested in it. I've made maps all my life, but I only really started the whole Ukraine mapping, and which slowly morphed into mapping different conflicts around in 2022. I think that's when I made my first maps of Ukraine. And I've been following the conflict since the Russia invaded in February 2022, and I don't really know why I found it interesting, but I guess I enjoyed looking at like how it was happening live and being able to witness history at a young age, and
That is a good
it
point.
was I just found it interesting, and from there it kind of morphed into a whole kind of a thing where I just religiously kind of followed it every day and looked at every update and checked the news, and slowly I was able to find better sources, change my perspectives on it, and gain better insight on everything to do with it.
I see. So let me dig a bit deeper into that. You said you have been making maps all your life. Is this like a geography interest, or just did you stumble upon the tools and then just get good with them? You know, like some people just learn IT or programming just because they grow up with a computer.
Yeah, so I don't remember when I first started getting interested in maps. It was when I was literally like a toddler. I think I've always loved maps. It's always been a fascination to me. But yeah, it's just something something to do with just I don't know how to explain it, but I've always been interested in it, and that's just changed over time. And my how I've been interested in it and what I do with that interest, it's just changed over time.
Interesting. So are you mostly into the maps, or have you also developed? So, as far as I know, about half a year back when you were on Calibrated, you were mostly into the maps, and you were like when you talked, for example, about Maidan, you said that you had not looked too far past 2014 or even around 2014, because as far as I remember that conversation, you were 8 back then, and
Yes, yeah.
so have you dug more into these parts, or are you mostly a mapping expert? Like, oh, in other words, what did you call yourself? Would you call yourself a mapping expert or a reporter, a journalist? How would you consider what you do?
kind of like a semi-professional reporter who makes maps. I guess that's kind of what I call myself. And I guess for Maidan, I am yet to look into it as much as I should, but I have done some more research into it. Still trying to make up my mind on that.
Awesome, awesome. So this will be the next part where I would like to ask you about yeah, about. So I have a thesis that you can only be a supporter of the mainstream narrative, so to say, by virtue of ignorance. If you know the facts, you cannot, you can no longer be a supporter. So this will be the next part where I would ask you how and why you support Ukraine. What is it that that pulls you in that direction? And do you have anything else about yourself? Yeah, I have some more questions about yourself, but we can move those afterwards on the personal plan. Like, for example, do you have a favorite battle? But let's do this afterwards. So, yeah, let me ask it this way. You generally said you support Ukraine. How has that, like, let me first ask you, how is that, how does it manifest itself? Are you like a support of the government or of their plight, of their situation? And in particular, I'll ask that afterwards, how has it evolved since about 6 months ago?
So I don't support the Ukrainian government necessarily. I support most of the Ukrainian armed forces, except for the quote unquote far right battalions and stuff. But primarily the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian armed forces, not the government though. I disagree with a lot of the decision making, refusing to go to the negotiating table, that kind of stuff.
I see.
Yeah, so
Has that evolved very much since yeah, half a year ago? So I'm asking this because you haven't taught the audience yet, but you said it on Scott last time. You were, as far as I know, you were 17. Perhaps you're 18 by now.
yeah, I'm 18 now.
All right, good. So I assume that your worldview is probably in a faster evolving pace because you have a very steep learning curve around that time, don't you?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Okay. So has
So,
that support toward Ukraine changed a lot in those 6 months?
definitely less so for the government. I mean, didn't like the government back then, but I've just kind of, when I went on that podcast, I don't believe the Kursk operation had begun yet.
Yeah.
And since the Kursk operation, my support for the government went from little to kind of nothing. So yeah, so it's just, I don't know, it's just awful seeing all those lives wasted for a useless PR operation, is how I call it. And that's just really kind of opened my eyes to what the Ukrainian government is in it for, and how they're going about trying to fight Russia. And I mean, I just feel so sorry for all the soldiers in Ukraine who who feel like they, especially the ones in the east, which who might feel like they've been forgotten. And
Yeah. No, I do the very same. It's war is a tragedy, but these guys, like in the cold, muddy fields, surrounded, and if they try to surrender, their own people shoot them in the back.
yeah, it's awful.
Yeah, sometimes when I feel bad, you can always tell yourself that it can always be worse, and you can think about stuff like this. Yeah. But in any case, so I'm a bit fuzzy on when you say you support Ukraine. Then you do support the AFU, but not necessarily the government. So if it's not the top echelons of the AFU, the political and general levels, when you say you support Ukraine, does it mean that you're then you have sympathy, or you're actually fully behind, say, I don't know, battalion level or maybe lower level military?
Yeah,
Would
I'd
you
say
say?
I'm fully behind the kind of the Ukrainian military. I mean, I know they aren't going to push Russia out, obviously, but I have my I what's the word? I support them, and I have their best interests at heart. I really feel for them, and at the same time, and also I know, like I said, I know they won't push Russia out, but I hope the negotiations won't be too terrible for them.
Mm-hmm.
I really do, yeah.
And
But Yeah, you go.
I was going to ask, so you believe also that their cause is righteous, defending their homeland and whatnot?
Yes, I do. I think that Russia was, even if there, I think, even if you have the argument that there was a coup, I still don't think an invasion of a sovereign nation is justified, including with the West. Like, for example, I am not a fan of the US when it comes to them constantly invading other countries. Same with Israel. Um, I'm I don't support most countries, to be honest, but it's just I view kind of battalion level and low Ukrainian AFU as defending themselves for the most part.
I see. Um, what do I have next here? So you mentioned the coup. I think it will be interesting to have an evaluation of that. You're still uncertain about whether it was a coup, and as far as I know, you were also uncertain about 6 months ago. And have has your uncertainty, let's put it that way, evolved in that time? Do you have any new insights, or have you mostly been preoccupied with doing the real-time mapping?
I have been more preoccupied with real-time mapping, if I'm being honest, but I have done some background research on kind of the causes of it and some of the events that took place, more so the causes, but just kind of looking a little bit into it. But I do need to do a lot more of that, and then I think then I can come to a definite conclusion on it, on whether it was or not.
Of course, yeah. So within your own circle of friends and within your own environment, do you get pushback a lot, or are you supported? Do you like debating?
I'm not a very good debater, if I'm being honest. I'm a lot better at typing and like not by debating, if you mean like speaking to someone like in a call or in real life, then I'm not very good at that. But if I'm just replying to people in comments, then I'm a lot better. I'm just not very good at talking.
Ah, I see. No, I think you're fine at talking. No, I'm asking because many people in this realm in the media space who tend to go against the mainstream narrative tend to have at least a bit of a contrarian fiber in them, right? And they like to debating. And I've been told that a lot. I personally love debating, and so I was just wondering whether it was a similar situation on your end,
Yeah.
So you said you're not the fittest when it comes to the whole geopolitical historical aspect, but let me nonetheless ask that question because I'm very interested in that myself, and I don't really have a concise answer myself. If you roll back time to say 1991, and then everything happens, the U.S. aid starts flowing into Ukraine, the whole Budapest Memorandum, collapse of the Soviet Union, the referendums in Crimea and across Ukraine, whether they want independence and so on. And then the clock rolls, and then we have the 2004 color revolution attempt in Ukraine, 2014, I'm going to just call it a coup. And then we go all the way up to December 2021, when Zelensky was amassing, what was it, like 120,000 troops next to Donbass. And Russia had tried to push for Minsk 1, tried to push for Minsk 2, even wrote this letter directly to the US and NATO headquarters, and tried on all diplomatic channels to avoid what was happening. What else could Russia have done to prevent, Ukraine falling into NATO, Ukraine attacking Donbass, and all the other consequences thereof, such as, for example, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Ukraine was planning on installing missile sites of the Americans, including Aegis ashore, like they have in Poland and Romania, which is just basically nuclear-capable missile silos. So what else could Russia have done at that point?
Well, I think just pushing further for negotiations between them, not arming the separatists in the east, and also trying to trying to lessen the tensions between the separatists in the east and the Ukrainian government. I think that would have been one good step to take. What was your other question? Sorry.
Well, that was it. Just what else could
Oh,
it
okay.
have done? I just gave a little bit of a context.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I guess just trying to prevent an invasion at all costs. And if it came to it, honestly, just trying to do it. I don't really know the steps to take this, but some form of government change in Ukraine. I mean, surely if Russia were to conduct, let's say, an information operation and were able to convince a relatively large number of the Ukrainian population, because what did Zelensky get in his election? In the election, was it 2018 election? I can't remember now.
20,
He didn't.
either 17 or 19. I'm not. I think it was 17. But yeah, he did get a high percentage. I think he was elected with 73% of the vote.
Oh wow, okay. I didn't realize it was that high. I thought it was more like 50, 60. Well, I guess just trying to prevent an invasion at all costs by some form of government change in Ukraine, influencing the Ukrainian population, information operations. I mean, anything to prevent if because was Zelensky was amassing troops on the Donbass, right?
Zelensky was, excuse me?
Zelensky was amassing troops on the Donbass border, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I guess pushing for negotiations because obviously Ukraine wasn't going to take back the Donbass. So pushing for negotiations and
Wait. Sorry for interrupting you, but what do you mean? Obviously, Ukraine wasn't going to take back the Donbass.
well, they weren't going to be able to
Ah,
if they tried. If they tried to, I don't think they would have been able to, even unless they had like US troops on the ground.
I I think allow me to push back. Let's put it this way. When they did the anti-terrorist operations under Poroshenko in 2014 and 15, which resulted in Minsk II because they were surrounded at Debaltsevo and they were about to be annihilated, then Merkel and Hollande pushed Russia to sit down at the table and create Minsk II. They came in with only, I think it was 40 or 60,000 troops. And they were, no, not even 30,000 troops, if I remember correctly, if memory serves me right. But then in, I believe it was in December 2019, Zelensky signed that famous decree, that infamous decree, which declared that they would take back the Donbass by force. And then at the end of 2021, in December, they were amassing aforementioned troops. But this was a massive mobilization. They had like 120,000 troops on the Donbass, and that would have been an overwhelming force. So I do believe that they would have done a lot of damage and probably taken Donbass, even with the arms supplies to the separatist Belarusians.
I personally disagree, just because I think that part of the Donbass was the most heavily industrialized, most densely populated part of the Donbass, which in itself is a very heavily populated and industrialized region of Ukraine, arguably the most. And from what I've heard, those fighters and the separatists in the Donbass were very radicalized. They were very against the Ukrainian government, and they would have done anything to prevent the Donetsk city and Luhansk from falling. So I don't think they would have. I think they definitely would have been able to do damage to them, but I don't think they would have been able to force them to capitulate.
Interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting thesis. If you think about it, also the Donbass had, at least prior to the conflict, a total population of 4 million. And I'm not sure of the populations of Lugansk city and Donetsk, but it is not inconceivable that even with 100 and 120,000 troops, they would not have had enough to actually take it on. Excuse me, that's the postman. Yeah, it's morning around here, you know. They come right in the morning.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I am to sum up your question, Russia could have or should have pushed more for a peaceful solution, for a diplomatic solution. I personally don't think, as far as I can see when reading through the history, they had exhausted their options. You know, the West and Ukraine just never wanted to implement anything peaceful, like neither Minsk I nor Minsk II nor anything in between. But I have heard from some experts that they still had some diplomatic channels that they could have gone. I don't have an answer myself. It's just, you know, this is a very widespread answer that war is just never an answer, that it should be avoided at all costs. But the thing is, and I like to give a metaphor for this, you know, like you have you have like a household, and you're just eating with your family, right? Someone just bursts in with a weapon, let's say a knife, and then stabs your partner or whatever, and then holds a knife in front of your kid and goes towards your kid, then obviously you would react. And then people say, yeah, okay, yeah. So if in a household situation, killing someone in self-defense, that there is this clause for self-defense whereby it is okay at some point to actually get into deadly violence, then so too is the case in international relations, right? There is certain unfortunate situations where a military operation or war have to be taken as a step. But yeah, um, let's put that aside. If I have another personal question, which goes in the direction of this whole debating thing, which is that I do on my end have a couple of friends, and I just recently talked to one, who are fervent Ukraine supporters and seemingly impervious to facts. Have you any approach of how to approach these people? Like those people that say that either don't know the facts or don't want to hear the facts, or if you talk with them, they say, yeah, how can you know? There's one side saying one thing, the other side saying another thing. You can't know what's true unless you're there. How would you answer to such a reply?
Well, just try and lay out evidence that can't be denied, I guess. Like, for example, if they're denying that Russia advanced somewhere, show the footage, show the geolocations, and put it at that. If they're still denying it, then I don't really know what you can do. At that point, they're so far into delusion that you can't really do much. But I guess, yeah, just laying out hard evidence and hard facts is kind of the best thing you can do. And eventually, I mean, once Ukraine does lose, they'll realize, obviously, but I mean, unless they start a new narrative saying, oh, Russia lost 20 billion North Koreans and 10,000 tanks to take half of Ukraine, that kind of stuff, So unless they start something like that for half of Ukraine rather than 2% of Ukraine, I think they will come to their senses eventually. You just got to try and help them get that way. I mean, that's what I've seen with a lot of pro-Ukrainians. At least that's what I've tried to do.
Yeah, apropos pro-Ukrainians, have you noticed how some people, especially, well, I tend to avoid the NAFO space, and I have avoided it for a very long time. Have you noticed how some people, like, obviously there's a lot of, very toxic people, impervious to facts or anything, just go in with bad faith, especially NAFO, NAFO. I think I had the same question with Scott. In any case, let's call it NAFO. And those people have made it part of their identity to virtue signal. And for them, virtue signaling is supporting Ukraine and calling Russia evil. And so it is so deeply part of who they are, they have made it such a central part of their identity that it's a psychological self-defense reaction to avoid the facts and to immerse themselves into the protection of the group and anonymity. And so trying to attack their position on Ukraine is like trying to attack them personally. What do you think of that analysis, so to say?
Well, yeah, I agree. They're all in their own little information echo chambers too. They only see and hear what they want to see and hear. They listen to media that affirms their biases and fits their narrative. It's just it's just sad, really, if I'm being honest, because I know what they're going to feel when Ukraine eventually does lose the war. I know what they're going to feel, and they're either going to feel really stupid and admit their mistake, or they're going to just disappear from the internet forever. So
honestly, I think I disagree on that one, for the sheer fact that you overestimate the intellectual integrity of these people. I do think that some of them will do what you said, but I think the largest part will just slither like a snake into a new narrative that sort of fits with what was back then and what's now, and they will have remarkable amnesia. They will completely have forgotten what they have said or posted back then, and they will be like, "Oh yeah, no, I always knew that Russia would win," you know?
yeah, it's kind of you kind of see the same thing happening with. Do you know David D?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that guy is so funny, man.
I know. Yeah, you could see something like that happening with him, I'd say.
I must say I haven't followed him. I know that he was Scott's favorite target for a while, and I enjoyed reading it for a while because it was just so absurd. And
No.
but yeah, but now I stopped. It seemed like he has gotten quiet, hasn't he? Quieter at
Oh,
least.
I don't know. He's blocked me ages ago, so so I don't really
Oh,
get
dude.
his tweets in my algorithm anymore. So
I mean, at some point, I thought to myself, I would love having him on a podcast. But honestly, I think the levels of intellectual dishonesty and bad faith he would bring into any conversation just makes it, yeah, not very
all you gotta
interesting.
do is listen to one of his space recordings, his Twitter space recordings, and you'll hear it all.
I didn't know he had those. I will.
He
I will.
does them. He does them every day, as far as I know.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I'm gonna look into that. So I have one last question on the personal side, and then well, we also ventured already a little bit of into history and geopolitics, which is like my second big chapter. But the other one is I heard that you were a published author. What does that
Yes.
What does that mean? Do tell.
Well, when I was fif no, 14, 15, I think, I started writing a book and published it. I think when I was no, yeah, I wrote it when I was 14 and published it when I was 15. And it's gotten into quite a few bookshops now. Libraries are the main kind of thing which we pushed it for. And yeah, it was just something that I did before I kind of got into mapping. I mean, I was always into mapping, but before I got into like Twitter and posting and reporting, that was kind of my big thing before that. And I originally I planned to write more, but I guess that's kind of turned from fiction writing into non-fiction writing now.
So fiction as in fantasy or science fiction or
Just like it was more like a kind of a wholesome story, I guess. It was like a wholesome story between a partially blind boy and a whale.
amazing. So
Yeah,
I ask also because I'm interested in publishing a book. It's just that I have a bit of an imposter syndrome, and I try to polish it to perfection. And I have one chapter that is virtually fully done, which is about ethics, and it ended up being it ended up being not a chapter, but probably a book in and of itself because it's like 100 pages. And I mean, it's complicated to explain it. I just go into an absolute idea of ethics, and I basically consider the question: how can I be good? And I mean absolutely objectively good, not good for the time period, you know? Because if you go back 200 years, holding slaves makes you perfectly good because you support the economy, these people are made to work, and so on and so forth, right? If you go back, I don't know, 100 years instead of 200, treating women like second-class citizens is perfectly fine, and you should not give them the right to vote because, you know, they just can't think, they're just hysterical and so on. So you're just perfectly good. And there's no reason to believe that history has ended and that our behavior and values, Western values today, are not going to be laughed upon in 100 years. You know, um, animal rights are as young as one generation. Like I believe the first one came into law about 20, 25 years ago. And so basically, I'm interested in an absolute ethics, and so I do a whole, you know, since I'm a scientist, I do a whole scientific approach to ethics and how can we anchor it in absolute objective facts. And one of the key findings that I do get from that analysis is you can only be as good as you have knowledge, right? You can only be as good as you can foresee the downstream consequences of your actions. And there's plenty of examples, but one example is, well, I like to think Ukraine, you know, or let's put a simpler example. We're all on one in the same page. You go back about 20 years, you have the Iraq War. And already in 2003, you could foresee that the whole narrative about weapons of mass destruction, it just doesn't have any evidence to support it. And so already back then, if you're lacking the knowledge and you support the whole thing because you lack knowledge, you basically have the blood of, what is it now, 1 million Iraqis on your hands. So you can only be as good as you know what's going on, right? What do you think about that?
yeah, I agree. And like I was saying before, the narrative changes, and like with the weapons of mass destruction, that changes too.
No. The narrative changes, the facts less so.
Yeah.
All right. So let us delve a bit more into the broader geopolitical context. You mostly focus on Ukraine, as far as I know, but there is also a conflict going on with the Yemenis, you know, the Houthis, or Ansar Allah, depending on how you want to call them, and generally in the Middle East and Gaza, in Gaza, Lebanon, and so on. So what is it that makes you focus mostly on Ukraine?
Well, I guess that's kind of how I started off, and I know more about it. I have a greater knowledge base, and I've been covering it for longer, so that's kind of the main reasons. But I've shifted more and more towards the Middle East, trying to make it like a secondary thing that I cover. There hasn't been as much news over the past couple of weeks, so I haven't been doing it as much. But it's Middle East it is very interesting, and once the war in Ukraine ends, I plan to make that my primary focus. I guess I'm kind of preparing myself with for that by covering it now, so I'll know more about it in the future. So yeah.
Do you consider Ukraine to be of greater importance for the historical context? Because you said you like being immersed in history.
I'm honestly not sure. I think Ukraine it is important as a state. I mean, but wait, so what do you mean by historical context? But how is it important as historical context?
Well, let me put it. Let me give you my piece of the cake, which is Ukraine is a pivotal conflict because it's pivotal because it marks the end of about 600 year period of Western supremacy and dominance on the world, because it shows that NATO, its central, well, organization for terrorism and for well, for the supremacy across the world. It's not quite the paper tiger, but it's much weaker than it was sold and vaunted to be, right? And Ukraine is just this pivotal geopolitical moment, which seems like, obviously with scientific uncertainty, which seems to mark the end of Western hegemony and has catalyzed the development of this multipolar world with BRICS and so on. And it's all very deeply linked with the whole Ukraine endeavor. And also Ukraine is the final piece on the chessboard if you consider the broader US geostrategic analysis and papers. If you go back, for example, to 1997, and Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, he also said that NATO expansion would have to end, and the biggest piece that they could take is Ukraine. It's just geostrategically such a valuable piece of land against their enemy, which is Russia, towards containment of Russia. That's what I mean.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, I agree then. It is, yeah, it's incredibly important. And like you said, it's ending Western hegemony, and it's proving to, I mean, even in China's context, it's proving to China that once Russia wins in Ukraine, it could even prove to China that they are able to go after Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan's obviously very different to Ukraine as an island nation. It's got a much more anti-China population. But it's also similar because Taiwanese and Chinese are similar people, and Ukrainians and Russians are similar people. They're kind of brothers. So it's got its similarities and differences, but it definitely the war in Ukraine could lead to other conflicts, which indirectly, well, it could indirectly lead to other conflicts, and also there's other things in the world happening which are influencing the whole multipolar world, such as the end of the French kind of influence in West Africa with Russia and China expanding their sphere of influence there. French withdrawals from Niger, Senegal. What was the other one? Guinea.
Niger.
No, Ivory Coast. Sorry, not Guinea. Ivory Coast.
Niger.
Oh yeah, Chad. Of course, Chad. Yep, that's what I meant by Niger. I get those countries mixed up, but there's a lot of things which are definitely pushing towards causing a change to a multipolar world. But I definitely agree. The war in Ukraine is one of the primary ones.
You mentioned China. Are you worried about a war in China in the next, I don't know, say 5 to 10 years?
I don't know enough about it to comment on it, to be honest. I need to look into that a lot more. China's my real weak spot on knowledge, but I guess I am worried from what I've seen, but I haven't validated those sources. So
Well, if I can make a little recommendation, I'm sure you know Brian Berletic. I think he was on
yep,
Calibrated as well. He has excellent news on news coverage of China, and it's just remarkable. Taiwan, since the UN resolution 2578 is 2758 is part of Chinese mainland. So by international law, if China were to invade Taiwan, it would be as if the US federal government decided to move troops from California to Wyoming. It's perfectly within their rights. It's on their territory, you know? So yeah, just as an apartheid. I personally must say I am quite worried about China because the conflict in Ukraine already is a huge war. However, the conflict in China would involve directly a confrontation between China and the US troops. And that would, I mean, it's hard to see how that would not escalate into nuclear war, which means the death of all of us, right? Well, but yeah, certainly. I too must say I very much feel like you. I feel immersed in history. I feel I'm on the losing side. I feel like I'm on the evil side, the Western side with all its neo-colonial supremacist policies, which we can see in Israel calling us, the jungle versus the light, as the former EU foreign minister, what was his name, said about Russia and Ukraine, and how like the Israelis said the same thing about, they're the light versus dark when it comes to Gaza, Israelis and Arabs. It's just racism. I actually, as a student, I thought we had gone past racism, back in school, but now I can see it in a much different light. It's more like supremacism. It has less to do with race than cultural supremacism.
and nationalism.
Nationalism too, yeah, obviously. So continuing that path, I have another geopolitical question, and then I have a few more questions that are perfectly in your alley, the mapping and the real-time moving of forces. But let me ask this last one I think it's the last one about geopolitics, which is, if the West had its way today, and if they defeated Russia, let's say, I don't know, they injected some 200,000 NATO troops, or found some wonder weapon, Leopard or F-16 or F-17, some imaginary plane or whatever, and they just defeated Russia and pushed it back. What do you think would happen?
Like pushed Russia out of Ukraine.
Pushed Russia out of Ukraine, and knowing NATO and seeing how their goal is a strategic defeat of Russia and how they wanted to decompose Russia into different nations. So let's say avoiding nuclear war. So
Yeah,
safe of nuclear
conventionally, yeah.
war. What do you think would happen?
Well, I think there'd be some form of political crisis in Russia, or either that, or there'd be a massive radicalization of the population. That or a political crisis where Putin is forced to step down and ultranationalists take power, and then Russia just goes all in, I guess, or begins fighting the US, because there's a lot of people in Russia who absolutely despise the West and would be prepared to go to war with them. There'd be new narratives saying that the West are Nazis rather than Ukraine, possibly, and there'd be all sorts of things that could happen. They could strengthen their ties even further with North Korea and China, depending on how they feel about Ukraine, and yeah, or they could just, or I guess, I mean, this is the most unlikely option in my opinion, but they could completely focus on another part of the world, such as Africa, and trying to further root out any remaining Western influence in there. So
I see, but it's hard to see how they would avoid nuclear conflict, right?
yeah, I mean, I don't think Putin would use nukes, honestly, but I doubt he would use nukes. I think I mean, he obviously knows what that cause, but and we all know what would happen if Putin uses nukes. I mean, the West is not going to not retaliate. So
No.
yeah, I doubt nukes would be used.
It's funny that you mentioned that with Putin because Scott was just recently on the Duran, which I guess is my favorite podcast on geopolitics, and I just love the guys. You know, Alex and Alexander. You know the Duran?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Awesome. And he mentioned a term that I coined in our first podcast, which is Schrödinger's Russia, right? It's this ambivalent Russia, according to the, since, I come from physics, this ambivalent Russia, according to the mainstream narrative, whereby on the one hand side, Putin is an absolute madman. He's imperialistic. He wants to restore the Soviet Union, which is why he went into Ukraine to just take the whole land and everything. But at the same time, don't fall for his blackmail, for his nuclear blackmail, because he would never use nuclear weapons, right? And I mean, there's plenty of these. There's this, and there's also Russia will not dare attack NATO, which is why we have to urgently take Ukraine into NATO. And simultaneously, if we allow Russia to win, once they take over Ukraine, they will attack the Baltics, who are in NATO. So which one
Yeah,
is it?
yeah, I've noticed that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I'm gonna write an article because I got kind of motivated again hearing Scott use that term on the Duran, shooting as Russia. But yeah. Anyways, let us now go more into into the center of your ballpark. Do you have so I have several questions, but let me first ask, do you have like a favorite battle or tactic that the Russians have used that you have seen play out in real time and again? For example, the encirclement tactic, which the Russians use repeatedly. Do you have any like favorite such troop movement or logistical aspect that you want to share with us?
Well, I guess probably they're always following the tactical heights. I mean, it's a pretty common thing, but especially in the Pokrovsk direction, the topography entirely favors Russia, especially with the railway lines going along the tops of the hills, the tops of the heights, and those provide cover with the windbreaks, and it just all plays in their favor. I made a post a while ago showing people the tactical heights and how they're laid out, and just how the tactical heights kind of curve round the Ukrainian strongholds, and it's almost as if they're made for a Russian advance. It's quite ridiculous actually. But as for favorite battle, probably tied between Avdiivka and Bakhmut. I covered Bakhmut before I started reporting on Twitter, but I remember following that very, very closely. And Avdiivka, I probably followed even closer, went down to like individual trench systems I would track. There was also another small battle called the Battle of Stepovia, which is a small village northwest of Avdiivka.
Mm-hmm.
Had a pre-war population of about 150, I believe, and it's maybe has about actually I think it had about 80. I think the pre-war population was actually about 80. It was less than 100, and it had about maybe 30 or 40 houses in it. And I remember tracking the status for every single one of those houses, and it was seeing the brutal conflict with that. I remember the first videos of Russia going into those eastern houses, and how Ukraine would constantly send in Bradleys to push them back to the railway line. And it was, tracking that progress for every single house really showed how brutal that the war is to me. It really, really showed it to me. But that was probably the most interesting one.
Okay. So I have two questions to follow up on that. The first one is, if I remember correctly, around Avdiivka, they used the fact that, they mostly used the Donbas militias supported by integrated into the Russian armed forces, right? And as far as I know, those people are mostly miners. And if I remember correctly, they used a strategic tunnel system to tunnel behind enemy positions in Avdiivka. Do I remember that correctly, or what happened there?
Yes, that is correct. They used one. I think it went from near the village of Spartak and went up into the southern. There's 3 streets in the southwestern part of Avdiivka, which it went up into, and they got behind the Ukrainian positions, creating chaos, scattered themselves amongst the houses there, and Ukraine started covering them with artillery. But that caused a diversion. Ukraine pulled a lot of its troops from the northeastern part of the city, allowing for a Russian spearhead, which eventually cut off the last road. So it was a very unexpected movement, that spearhead. But the that attack through the underground tunnel, or I think it was a sewage pipe actually.
Yeah.
And yeah, and that attack was what facilitated the collapse of the city's defenses.
But interesting then. So I had it. So I knew that I remember that it happened correctly, but I didn't really know how it happened because as far as I had known, I had thought I didn't, follow it too close in detail. I thought they went through the sewage pipe and then just shot the Ukrainians in the back, which then opened the spearhead there. But no, but you corrected it, which is that it caused a diversion and then they moved in from the north. That's
Yes, yeah, the north, yeah, moved in from the Darches, the little holiday house areas, in the northeast. They'd already been pushing there. Actually, they've been trying to push into the northeastern city limits, and Ukraine was putting up a lot of defense there. So then they pulled that maneuver in the south, and Ukraine diverted their troops, and then they spearheaded to the highway.
Interesting. I remember there was another, I think, part of the battlefield, which was, I think, also close to Avdiivka, somewhere in the Donbass, where they actually dug a tunnel along the course of
Yeah,
several months
yeah,
and then blew it up,
Toretsk.
right? It was Toretsk.
I think so. Yeah, yeah, Toretsk,
Yeah.
or just east of Toretsk. I think it was a place called Zalizne.
Mhm.
Yeah.
What made me wonder is how did they manage to dig that? Because that usually causes tremors on the soil, and you can hear that. But I heard that they were digging right as the artillery was firing or something like that. So they
Yes, I forgot about that. Yeah, yeah, they did do that, didn't they?
interesting.
Yeah, I know that tactic, those tactics. I wonder if they'll be repeated again. I don't think they will, honestly, because the front lines are moving a lot faster now, and there's not really any major strongholds left for Ukraine that were pre-war strongholds. So yeah, I don't think they'll have to use that tactic again.
Have you seen any similar ingenious tactical successes by the AFU?
Probably I mean, I didn't follow it as much then, but from what I've heard, the Kharkiv counteroffensive was pretty good for them. But then again, it was the Russians were spread very thin there. So it wasn't necessarily ingenious, but the way it was commanded was done well.
Professionally, I see. So you also mentioned the rapport de force, the numbers that you have there, which is, so let me ask you about, since we are around Avdiivka, what was what were the different strengths around Avdiivka? Like how many troops roughly did Ukraine have defending it, and how many did Russia have attacking it? Like what was the
Oh, I can't really
number?
remember. I have the number 5,000 in my head for Ukraine, like in the city,
Mhm.
like directly in the city, and on the coal plant, the coking coal plant. Um, I think it was about 5,000, and whereas Russia directly attacking the city, I've got the number 30,000 in my head. That could be completely wrong, but that's just what I seem to remember.
Okay, so a
But
massive.
it was a massive advantage. I know it was a massive advantage. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Apropos coke plant, have you heard Alex Christoporo's take on Zelensky? He's like, "What? They take the
Yeah.
coal plant? No!"
Yeah. Yes, I have heard that.
I mean, honestly, I would personally think if someone takes cocaine, that has no implications on their ability to lead a country or not. You know, that these two are completely disjoint phenomena. You can say something about, yeah, but maybe he's not very responsible dealing with his body, therefore he will not be very responsible dealing with the country. But no, honestly, we all drink coffee in the morning. Cocaine is a bit stronger, sure, but whether or not he's a cocaine, well, okay, if he's an addict, that's a different story, I must admit. But whether or not he takes cocaine to function in a very stressful situation where he probably has to pull all-nighters repeatedly, I would say I would grant him this. He's under tremendous stress.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I
yeah,
agree. He's under a lot of stress, especially with the Russian offensive in Pokrovsk.
mhm. I wanted to ask also something about a follow-up question on the houses in Stepovoye, or is it Stepove or Stepovoye? I think I've heard the two names.
Stepovaya is the Russian name. I call it Stepovia. I just like it. It just sounds better.
Okay, I see. Oh yeah, I remember how Scott was butchering the names in Ukraine.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
he says it as from what I've heard, he says Ukrainian name. He says a mix of Ukrainian and Russian names just to try and be neutral.
yeah, no, I mean, I think I suggested it back in the podcast that we had, is that in order to pronounce the names more originally or correctly, so to say, he should just speak with a Russian accent. and then just speak like that and then say the names and then they just pop up correct. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
In any case, about Stipovoi, I wanted to ask you, since you were following the houses so closely, and I have never done that, and I'm actually very interested in what you do. The way it happens, like the way I picture it, and then, as I said, I haven't followed it, is you have like 150 people, what is it, maybe like 10, 20 houses scattered across a village. I imagine like that, in a typical Ukrainian fairly flat landscape. And then you have individual troops moving into the house, maybe holding it for 1 or 2 days, and then a Ukraine FPV drone comes, or maybe there's an artillery barrage, and then you have a countering Russian barrage, and then after like 2, 3 days, they're forced to leave this house, get into the next house. How does it work in real time? Is that more or less the picture, or is it more on
Yes,
on a scale of days or minutes or weeks, or how does it work?
it's very difficult to tell. I didn't have very good ground sources back then, but I was more following the footage. But it was more they more used the basements because the Russian artillery barrages had already destroyed the village before they even reached it.
Mm.
So
Okay.
they were using the basements. Some of the houses in the rear were somewhat intact, but those were under Ukrainian control. And by the time the Russians had reached them, they're just rubble. So it
Mm.
was more hiding in the basements, and then the Ukrainian FPV drones would go in and kind of they'd just fly in and do their thing. But the Russians generally would try and hold it for enough time for reinforcements to arrive, and then they keep pushing forward.
Hmm. Interesting. When you watch the footage, isn't it very hard to tell which troops are Russians and which troops are Ukrainians?
It depends on who posts it, really, because I get it directly from the source, from the brigade's Telegram channels.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, are
So
you following the tele? Yeah, okay.
yeah, yeah. So
So
it
you said
was
the,
mainly the
sorry, go ahead.
47th. Yeah,
Go
I
ahead,
was
go
just
ahead.
gonna say it was mainly the 47th that was covering that area, the strike drone company, which is where I got most of my footage from.
Okay. So you said on a brigade level, but as far as I know, at least in the beginning of the war, the special military operation, the Russians were holding very tightly onto their information. There was very little seeping through in terms of clips and so on. Like the only clips that they were publishing through the Ministry of Defense, they were weeks old in order to not compromise their tactical and strategic movements, right? Have you Can you confirm that, or am I wrong in that assumption? And did the Telegram channels of the individual battalions or brigades only pop up months, if not years, into the war?
I didn't follow. I've only had Telegram for a year, so about a year and a half. So I wouldn't know. But if I go back and I have looked at previous people's posts from doing geolocations from 2022, and I think they were posting relatively soon after. But it's definitely it's gotten quicker and quicker as the war's gone on, as far as I know.
Mhm. Okay. Um, I have another one. So I asked you about like your favorite battle and or tactic. Have you also been interested in the equipments that the various armies use? You can go from the, I don't know, AK-72, I believe is the main weapon of the Russians, all the way to something like the Oreshnik. Do you have anything that particularly struck you?
More kind of the missiles, I guess. That's kind of the only thing I know a decent amount about, but I don't know enough about the small arms and stuff like that. So it's more it's more the missiles, which are the main thing I follow, like the KH-101s, the Iskanders, that kind of stuff. So
All right. Well, I'm just generally technologically interested, and I personally was kind of fascinated by the alligators, the Camo 52s, especially during the counteroffensive in 2023, and they just defeated so many tanks. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but they're also the only helicopter worldwide which has an ejection seat, and it's the one where the rotor blades just pop off to allow the pilots to eject. Have you seen that?
no, I haven't, but I can imagine.
There was also
Yeah.
some crazy footage of them just going on the river, like literally centimeters above the water, and that was quite impressive by the pilots, especially
Wow.
for such a like 30-ton machine just maneuvering like that. Quite
What's
something.
this called? The caterpillar?
The
You
Caterpillar?
say?
No, the
What do you
Camel
say?
52. The
Oh, Camera 53. I misheard
the
you. Sorry.
the gunship with the double propeller going in different directions.
Oh, okay.
That one. All right. So I have two more for you. So I should face this one up a little, which is that we have had close to 3 years now of conflict. And here in Switzerland, I haven't checked the exact numbers, but I estimate that we have had an accumulation of maybe, I don't know, several hundred, maybe 3,000 articles and media reports and whatnot about the conflict. We've had news articles, we've had radio shows, we have had TV interviews, we've had, all sorts of such media. And I challenge anyone in the audience, but I challenge anyone in Switzerland or anyone anywhere to find one among these, maybe let's call them 5,000 articles that is pro-Russian. And then tell me, how can we have a democracy if we don't have impartial, neutral information of the population? And we're not even in war. You could argue that at war you need to, I don't know, rally the population behind a goal and anything. So here's my question to you. One, is it the same over at where you're at the other end of the world in New Zealand? And two, do you think the situation around the world or geopolitically would be different if we actually had neutral, impartial, fact-checking journalism with accountability?
Well, in New Zealand, we don't actually get much coverage of the war in Ukraine or other wars. Our news is so boring here. It's all like
Oh,
if there was a random robbery in Hamilton or something, it's very boring news here. There's hardly anything on international stuff. But when there is, it is generally quite pro-Western. What I've noticed is it kind of sways between independent foreign policy with neutral reporting and much more kind of pro-Western depending on the government, especially those state-run outlets. Yeah, depending on which government's in power, it just kind of changes. So more influenced, trying to tell people what they want to hear. So if there's a government in power that's pro-Western, and if there's a government rather than a government being in power that's more independent foreign policy, then the media outlets will be much more likely to say what more people are going to want to hear. So they'll say much more pro-Western things if there's a pro-Western government in power, because that means more people have voted for it, meaning that there's more pro-Westerners in the country. So that's kind of what I've noticed. What was your second question? Sorry.
do you think the geopolitical situation, the world or the war, would be different if we actually had, let's say in the West, neutral, impartial, fact-checking media with accountability? And with accountability, I mean, for example, if someone writes in the newspaper something like Iraq has WMDs, that they actually get taken to court for pushing a war through their articles without having any evidence, which obviously fact-checking and gathering the evidence is their job as a journalist.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think neutrality is so important, but I think more. How would I put this? I think it would be more. I don't think it would really affect it. Like, it would affect more people's worldviews more than the actual conflicts themselves, I think. I mean, it could definitely affect them indirectly, but it would be more the people's worldviews. But then again, that would indirectly affect who people would vote for. So it'd be more Western media, I guess, rather than like Russian or Chinese media. But since people are more likely to make their own opinions when they're reading media that's neutral, so they have the time to find their own opinions. So I guess that could indirectly influence conflicts, as if people vote in a government which is pro-Russian or pro-peace, or rather than being wanting to send aid to Ukraine, then that could affect it. But would the media changing that, would that actually change the results in elections? I'm not too sure, because it would be more it would, because a lot of people don't really have the time to look into things themselves, so it'd be difficult for them to make up their own opinions. That's why a lot of them rely on mainstream media.
No, I agree that most people, yeah, don't get informed through lack of time and motivation. But I personally am convinced that we would have saved probably millions, if not tens of millions of lives and entire countries if we had neutral media. Bear in mind, the whole Vietnam War was stopped thanks to massive protests and public dissatisfaction. So I do believe that all these weapons shipments to Ukraine would have been stopped. The war might have even been avoided to begin with, or otherwise, at least it would have been much shorter than it has been going on now. But yeah, it's maybe one day, you know. So I have another one, which I also asked Scott, and I'm kind of interested in that one, which is say like you're 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 way ahead of all of us, right? Being 18 in this media space. So say in about 3, maybe 5 years, you find yourself with a couple million followers and subscribers, and you like branch out maybe into broader geopolitics or covering other wars, and you start being invited to conferences, I don't know, Piers Morgan shows and whatnot, maybe even some mainstream media outlets, or you get even given your own talk show on some mainstream media, Australian or New Zealand platform. Do you think you will be able to keep your integrity being immersed in all that, you know, mainstream system, people around you, incentives, and so on?
Yeah, I'm pretty confident I could. Yeah, I mean, my whole thing's been trying to say things as they are and just not telling people what they want to hear and saying the difficult truths, and while maintaining a neutral kind of maintaining neutral reporting. I mean, there would be. I really hope I could. I'm pretty confident that I could though. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I hope so too. I've asked myself the same question, and I do think so too, because I guess part of my identity is I put truth before, you know, social standing and value, which gets me also into all sorts of trouble with friends because often they expect support, but I'm like, no, let's evaluate this for what's right and what's wrong, right? But yeah, in any case, good answer. So I don't think I have anything else not in my list of questions. I would have loved to talk more about how and why supporting Ukraine, but I do think that you would rather be on a more firm standing, like have read about it more.
Yeah.
So we can do this
Yeah, I
another time.
agree. Yeah,
And
that'd be good.
yeah, do you have anything else?
No, nothing I can think of. No.
All right. Well, awesome to meet you, to hear from you, Ally. Thank you for coming on the Nexus, and see you another time, I hope.
Cool. Thank you so much.
All right, have a good day, man.
You too.
Bye.